But I want to start with a statement that is foundational to this series. And I think this is where we're going to go, and this is what I think is so important that we keep in mind, and this is that statement. Nothing is more life-giving, life-enriching, and life-enhancing than relationships. Nothing in this world is more life-giving, life-enriching, and life-enhancing than relationships. I mean, when you think of the happiest moments in your life, the ones that bring you the most joy, the one that brings you peace and you feel content, you feel, boy, life is great. I guarantee when you think back to any of those kinds of moments, you're going to say that there was a relationship attached to it. It was a relationship with people you love and people who love you. It's not so much what you were doing that made it such a great moment. It's who you were doing it with. We have those great moments because that's what relationships are all about. But just as true as this statement is, the opposite statement is just as true. There is nothing more joy-sucking, peace-robbing, the saddest, gut-wrenching moments have a relationship attached to them as well. When you think of when your heart felt ripped out, it had something to do with a relationship. Someone who you loved. It might have been someone who you used to love. But it's true that this statement, it makes perfect sense, but so does the other. And we've experienced both. Many of us know those moments, right? The birth of a baby or a vacation with our family, or maybe a special occasion, or just one of those seasonal celebrations. And we have these great times and these great memories. But some of us also have memories of breaking up with a boyfriend, or the end of a marriage, or the rebellion of a child, or we're right now feeling disconnected from a family member and we're not talking. We know this is true both ways because we've experienced both. Here's what else is true. The quality of our relationships affects the quality of our lives. There's no doubt about it. Lots of research has been done that when you have good, solid, positive, life-enhancing relationships, it affects your spiritual life, it affects your mental life, it affects your emotional life. It affects every part of you. That's why having great relationships is so important. That's why the quality of them matter, because the healthier the relationship, the healthier we are in all of the areas of our lives. All of us need and all of us long for strong, healthy, vital, joy-giving relationships. We all long for that. And when we don't experience, especially from those who we should experience it from, we feel like something is missing inside. And in my role as a pastor, I get to peer into people's lives. I get to look at what's going on beneath the surface. I get a front row seat to some of the things that are going on in their relational world. Here's what I need to say this morning. Maintaining healthy relationships, there are so many things in our culture that fight against that being a reality. Because our culture has become a culture where me is the priority and we is secondary. We have a culture of entitlement, my wants, my desires, my happiness. It's got to be what I want, what I need. Our culture is bombarded with that kind of thinking. Our culture, because of the demands and the responsibilities of life that we keep piling on ourselves with workplace and church and with family life, sometimes we are so overloaded with deadlines and responsibilities, we don't have enough time that is required to pour into relationships to make them vital, healthy, and are alive. We have this fixation on devices. We talked about that last September, and how the fixation on these devices and the importance of them are keeping us more isolated from real relationships and keeping us thinking we're doing okay because we have these online ones. And one of the things that I see in our culture is this divisive attitude where we don't want to sort things out. When there's a conflict, we'd rather run and hide. When there's a conflict, we would rather just avoid it. When there's a conflict happening, we just want to end the relationship instead of working through the conflict. And all of this, all of that mindset fights against vital, healthy, life-giving relationships. I talk to lots of people who are experiencing all sorts of relational cracks. Marriages are seeming to struggle at an alarming rate. And it's not just in our culture, it's between those who call themselves Christ followers. I see this attitude between parents and kids. It's not getting better, it's getting worse. I see friendships that are torn apart and tossed away like they don't even matter. And this deeply concerns me, and this should deeply concern you, because we've just concluded that the quality of our life is determined by the quality of our relationships, and nothing makes life better than the relationships we have. We should be concerned about this. In a world where there are these relationships that are struggling and fragmented, I call them rocky relationships. The good news is that God speaks right into the culture that we live, and God gives us insight, and God gives us wisdom so that we can have relationships that are healthy and vital in life. Doesn't matter the configuration, whether it's a marriage, parents with kids, or vice versa, friendship, somebody who you're closer to in the workplace, whatever. Doesn't matter what the relationship is. God speaks into those. And for the next 4 weeks, I want to look at some of God's wisdom when it comes to having the kind of relationships that enhance the quality of our life. But so often we look at some of this insight and wisdom, and we just have the traditional same old list. And if the same old list was working, I'd say let's just do it again, but it's not. And so we need to look at other characteristics that I believe sometimes get left out when we talk about relationships. So to begin any series on relationships, we need to talk about the foundation of every great relationship, and that is love. It's love. Love has to be the foundation of a great relationship. It really does. I think sometimes we're not so afraid of loving, husbands and wives and moms and dads, but sometimes even in church community where we're close to people and we call ourselves family, we're afraid to think about love or to say the words, I love you, because it's been so misunderstood and misconstrued in our culture. And I think there's something sad about that. Paul, the writer in 1 Corinthians 13, which most brides think was written for them, Paul didn't have brides in mind at all when he wrote the love chapter. In fact, he was writing to a church, and the church was living in a culture that is not that much different than we live in right now. And this church was relationally dysfunctional. There were a lot of cracks that had developed. People were fragmented in their relationship. They were fragile. There were some groups of church people, Christ followers, not talking to others. And yet, so they only had one church in Corinth, so you couldn't say, well, I'm leaving because they're not talking to me. You had to go. You had to figure it out. So they sat on both sides of whatever configuration they sat on. And this church was divided over so many issues. And here's what's surprising. These people thought they had it spiritually all together. They thought they were growing in their relationship with Christ, and yet they argued over so many things. They argued over things like who is the best preacher, Apollos or Paul? Who's the best leader? Do we have to do church on Sunday, or is there another day that's just equally as important? They argued over what kind of music is okay for worship, and I'm thinking, whoa, that could have been written today. We still have those kind of conflicts and conversations. They argued over whether you could sue a fellow Christ follower, or can you eat food that's sacrificed to an idol, or what spiritual gift is most important, or did Jesus rise from the dead, and is that important? Is he coming back, and do we just give whatever we want, or should we give a tithe? Those were the kind of things they argued over. And these continual disagreements created relational dysfunction in this church. And it's in the middle of this letter, or getting close to the end of this letter that Paul is writing, that he decides to tackle the issue of love. And in the first 3 verses, he says, you can do all these amazing things. You can speak so well, or you can care so much, or you can give sacrificially, or you can have faith that looks like it's off the charts. But if it is not motivated by love, if love is not a key part of it, if love is not enriching what you're doing, you are wasting your time and wasting your breath. And then he comes to 1 Corinthians chapter 13, 4-7, and he gives this amazing definition of some of the details of what this love looks like. And as I read these verses, I want you to think of your relationships, whether they're going good or they're not going so well. And ask yourself, if I loved like this and I was loved in return like this, would it be a game changer? Because I think it would. Look what he says. Love is patient. We could just forget reading the rest, right? And that's right there. Love is kind. Love does not envy. It does not boast. In other words, talking about how great we are. It's not pride. There can be no pride in love. It does not dishonor others, put them down, talk negatively about them, talk behind their backs. It is not self-seeking. It's not all about me. It's not easily angered like that. That's not the tone within a love relationship. It keeps no record of wrongs. I love that one because I need to know that God loves me that way, that he doesn't keep any record. But in our relationships, he's saying, don't keep records either. He goes on, love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with truth. The truth must win the day. He says, love always protects, love always trusts, love always hopes, love always perseveres. And then in the next verse, he says these words, this kind of love should never fail. When I read that description and I think of my relationships and think, if I could raise the bar, if only a couple of percent on any one of those characteristics, I know my relationships could be better. And I believe you believe that too. Now, for today's message, we've got the foundation, and that'll be our foundation for the weeks to come. But for today's talk, I want to go back to just one of these verses, and I want to look at it out of another version of the Bible. It's called the Amplified Version, and it kind of spells out, love, trust, love, 2 words. It gives us a little bit more detail. And I think it really makes a difference. So let's go back to verse 7 and read it from the Amplified. It says this. Love bears up under anything and everything that comes. It is ever ready to believe the best of every person. Its hopes are fadeless under all circumstances, and it endures everything without weakening. Wow. And the only phrase I want to look at today is this phrase, it is ever ready to believe the best. And when I'm talking about ever ready to believe the best, I'm talking about when something happens or someone makes a choice or someone does something that is out of character. They don't normally act this way. This is not something that is part of a repeated pattern. I'm not talking about that. I'm just talking about something that's a little bit out of character, out of the norm. What do? Do you choose to believe the best? Is that the place that you go? Do you choose the best, or do you have the other alternative? It's to assume the worst. To assume the worst. When something happens that is out of character, will you choose between these two options? Will you choose to believe the best, or will you assume the worst? A husband walks into his house. As he gets in the door, he can barely open the door because there's all these packages with women's clothes and accessories in these bags. And money is tight, really tight. And they are there's a mountain of debt, and they have agreed on a budget, and they've agreed that they would not spend any money unless they talk to each other. And he sees all of these things scattered at the doorway in these bags. Does he believe the best or assume the worst? How about your teenage son and daughter who have a midnight curfew? It is now 1:30, and they're not home. And you have tried calling and texting, and they're not responding. They don't normally do this, but this time they have. And if they're going to be late, they normally call you or they normally text you, and that hasn't happened either. In that scenario, do you believe the best or assume the worst? What about a husband comes home late? It's his third night in a row coming home late. and it's Friday night, and he's late on Friday night, and his wife says, by the way, that night we're having friends. Could you come home early and help me get ready? And by the time he shows up, there's about 10 minutes before these friends are going to arrive for dinner. Does she believe the best or assume the worst? Everyone is posting on Facebook about a party that they've been invited to, and it's at a friend's home that you're fairly close to, and they've invited you to other parties, but somehow your name has been left off the guest list this time. Do you believe the best or assume the worst? Last one. When the phone rings and the caller ID says it's your mother-in-law, do you believe the best or assume the worst? Just asking. Just asking. I usually just say, Sue, it's for you. When something that happens in your relationship that is out of character, abnormal, you don't have all the facts, what do? Do you choose to believe the best or you choose to assume the worst? Quick poll. How many, you can raise your hands when I tell you to, how many of you have chosen to believe the best and the worst actually happened? Raise your hand. Should be a whole bunch of us. How many of us, on the other, have assumed the worst, and we have rehearsed the conversation when that person is in contact with us, and we've been all sort of amped up, and we feel this flow of energy and anger and emotion, and when they come through the door, we let them have it, and then they tell us what was going on, and we go, why did I even open my mouth and say those things that I cannot take back? How many of us have done that one? All of us. I had one of those. It was when I was first working in the marketplace. And I was just a manager of a funeral home for a year and had all these young guys working for me. And it was in December, early December. It was pretty quiet in the funeral home, which is probably a good thing in December. And these guys took off and they were gone. And all of a sudden they're gone for about a half an hour and it just all breaks loose. Phone calls, all sorts of things happening. People with needs and things that need to happen because there's been deaths in their family. And I try paging those guys. Yeah, we did not have cell phones. We used pagers. I paged them, nothing. I paged them 10 minutes later, nothing. I paged them 20 minutes later, nothing. And I'm seething. I'm calling these guys all sorts of names in my mind. And I'm rehearsing in my head exactly what I'm going to say when they come in the door. I am going to let them have it. And I hear the doorbell ring at the back. And I go to the garage where they are. And I let them have it. And they all kind of put their heads down and they kind of went to do their work that I had assigned them. And one of the guys says, do you know what was going on there? I said, I don't care. I don't want to know. He said, well, you should know. These guys really appreciate you. They say this is the best environment they've ever been part of working in, and you're a great leader. And they thought they'd go and get you something for Christmas to say that. If I could have replayed the clock. So anyway, I let them get their work done because that was important. And I gathered them all back. I think it was in the garage, actually, and said, guys, I have messed up big time. I owned my part of it. I apologize for it. They were kind enough to kind of say, yeah, no problem, but I know it stung, and I know it hurt. And I said, I should have trusted you guys, but I didn't. You see, I do like many of us do. Instead of believing the best when it's out of character, I assumed the worst. Now, when I say believe the best, there's some things that I don't mean. There are some things that I don't mean. I'm not saying that you should ignore repeated patterns of behavior that is happening in your relational world, whatever the configuration is. I'm not talking about serious problems that shouldn't be addressed or sweeping issues under the carpet so they somehow go away. I'm not saying that we shouldn't deal with an issue that needs to be dealt with head on. I'm not implying that we're blind to the truth because it says love rejoices in the truth. I'm not talking about that. I'm not implying that we should think positive thoughts of the other person no matter what, or am I suggesting that we toss discernment out the window? That's not what I'm implying. What I'm implying is that when something happens that's out of character, doesn't add up, there are no outstanding unaddressed issues, that it's not part of things that they do over and over again, and it doesn't fit the person. It's not the way they normally act. That's what I'm talking about. Will we believe the best or assume the worst? Now, as I've said before, and I haven't done a lot of it lately, but as I've said before, a sermon is never great unless there's a picture. And so I'm going to do a couple of pictures because we haven't done them in a while. And I want to sort of talk about what I'm really referring to. So I'm going to move over to the board here. And I want us to think about a pendulum. We have swings that way or that way. This is believe the best, and this is assume the worst, and this is kind of the middle. Here's what I know about our culture. Maybe it's because of the political overtones. Maybe it's because of the cynical nature that people have built up because of social media, or because we are able to, give our opinion and tear others down. I don't know. But I think that the culture sits this side of the middle. Here's what I believe. I believe Christ followers need to be different, and we need to sit on that side of the pendulum. You see, our culture, they want to continue to move it this way, and they are continuing to move it that way to assume the worst more often. As Christ followers, I believe we want to move it here. Now, we're never going to get it perfect. We're never going to get it 100%. That is never going to happen. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about taking little steps of progress towards believing the best more often of one another, whatever the relationships are. That's what we want to do. Now, there are some things that stand in the way of making this work. The first is this. There's nothing in the relational trust account. You will never believe the best if your trust account relationally is depleted. You see, as we do life together, as we live in relationship, whatever the configuration, we add things to the trust account by telling the truth and keeping our word and not betraying or hurting one another. We put things in the trust account. However, you can easily make withdrawals because of repeated behavior, and if it's repeated enough withdrawals, your trust account can be bankrupt. And so if that's where you are never going to be able to believe the best. You're always going to assume the worst. You probably need to work on trust in the relationship first. Because it says that love trusts, right? And so trust is a key part. Second thing is an obstacle is this. You're not committed to making the relationship work. Here's what I need to say to all couples here. Whatever's going on in your relational world, I need you to hear me. You need to be committed to the sacredness of marriage more than you're committed to the other person. Marriage is sacred, instituted by God. It reflected in Genesis chapter 2 what it means to be perfectly created in the image of God and to live in union like the Trinity does. It is sacred. Marriage is sacred. We need to be committed to the sacredness of marriage more than the other person, because the other person is going to drive you crazy. That's why we have to be committed to that. If you're not committed, you're always going to assume the worst. No matter what the other person does, you're going to assume the worst. You're going to question every move. You're going to question every motive. You're going to have resentments. And times you're wanting to rationalize and justify why the relationship would end. And so you've got to be committed to making the relationship worse, because it says love perseveres. Thirdly, the relationship is all about you. If that's the case, if me is more important than we, if you're self-focused, it's all about your wants, your desires, your happiness, why you deserve it. If you have a long list of unrealistic expectations that have never been shared but they're not living up to, you're always going to assume the worst. You always is. Because it says love is not self-seeking. And when we get self-seeking, it is hard to believe the best. And then this one is, you have never admitted or dealt with a personal area of brokenness. I know lots of people who have lots of brokenness, and they don't admit it, they don't see it, they pretend it's not there, they cover it up with all sorts of spiritual cliches and ideas, and they don't admit it, and it's out of this brokenness. Maybe it's because of something that happened in their past or whatever, but they just can never believe the best because there's some area of them that is broken. If you lack trust, if you lack commitment, if you are not other-focused and you have not done personal healing, you will never be able to believe the best. Maybe you've got some negative core messages from growing up. You don't measure up, you're not worthy, you don't matter. Or maybe there's this lack of self-esteem or self-worth. You know what? If that's your area of brokenness, you're never, ever going to be able to do this. You see, our natural gravitational pull in our culture is to assume the worst. It is to assume the worst. Now, diagram number 2. If you've ever come to me for pastoral counseling, I have drawn this diagram for you. I have also used versions of it here at BCC because I think this really explains so much. So we have a situation that takes place. Let's just say it is out of character. You know, shopping bags by the door, the husband late 3 nights in a row, it's 1:30 and they've missed their curfew, whatever it is. You have a situation, and that situation begins to disturb your thinking. This is your thinking. This is your mind. And your thinking gets clouded. What a beautiful picture that is. Your thinking gets clouded. It gets clouded by a number of things. Some of those things are, I'm just going to put some letters down the side. The first one is an N. You just naturally gravitate to being more cynical or skeptical. Whatever reason, it's like it's your spiritual gift or you were born with some inherent trait. For some, it might be the home, I'll put an H. It's the home that you grew up in. Maybe you were never trusted. Maybe they never believed the best. Maybe they motivated with guilt and shame all the time and control. And in your thinking, you just can't go there because it's the home you grew up in. And it's kind of clouded your thinking. Maybe it's a PR. That's a past relationship. Maybe it's a past relationship. Something in your past relationship right now is entering your mind, and it's being, your present circumstance is looking back at something out of a past relationship. Maybe someone broke trust. Maybe someone didn't give you the benefit of the doubt. Maybe someone set unhealthy expectations that you could never live up to. Whatever, but something in a past relationship is clouding your thinking. This is a big one, the T. The T word, that is trauma. Maybe what's happening right now in the present moment, it feels traumatic and it is triggering a trauma. The T is trigger. It's going to trigger a trauma of the past. And then the last one is CR, and that's a current relationship. Maybe something's been happening in that current relationship. Maybe there's a little bit of a repeated pattern. Maybe someone did something that hurt you or wounded you or crossed over a line, and it is clouding your thinking when this situation happens. Well, when our thinking stays clouded, what happens is that eventually it affects our emotions. And when the thinking gets clouded, so do our emotional part of our brain. Your emotions are not in your heart like we romanticize. Your emotions are at the back of your brain, near the brain stems where they're contained. And so this affects this. And your emotions kind of get engaged, and that's where you start to, rehearse what you're going to say and all of those kind of things, and you feel angry and you feel amped up. And eventually that leads to a response. Now, this response is either assume the worst or believe the best. With all of this going on, when this gets clouded and emotions get going, this is where you're going to go. And the longer you stay in this, what I call the spin cycle, the more you think about this, the more your emotions get engaged, everything heads downhill. That's what happens. And most of you are going, I know that diagram. I live that diagram. That's what's happening to me. And the issues are here or here primarily. Here or here. Usually it's both. And you might be thinking to yourself, you know what? I'm never going to break the back of this. I'm always going to assume the worst, just the way I'm wired, the way my brain has got wired. I'm here to say to you that's nonsense. You do not have to be this way. You do not have to live this way. You can break free from this. You know what I think is so cool? This is what I think is so cool, is that this is brain science that we're learning more about today. The Bible writes into these situations 2,000 years ago before people knew about brain science. That's how I know the Bible is true, because it speaks to stuff we're learning today. And Peter, one of Jesus' closest followers, he's writing this letter. He's writing a letter to people that are suffering big time. They've been isolated and shunned and shoved away by family, friends, and those who are close to them, or their children, or their parents, simply because they follow Jesus. And Peter starts this section of his letter, and he says these words. Therefore, since Christ has suffered in his body, in other words, he knows what it's like to suffer. He knows what it's like to feel pain. He knows what it's like to be betrayed. In fact, he's saying. He knows what it's like to be you. Arm yourself with the same attitude. What he's saying is we need to have the same attitude as Jesus, because the attitude that Jesus had moves in this direction. In fact, Jesus does this. He always believes the best. So he says we need to arm ourselves with the same attitude. Him and Peter must have been talking one time over coffee or whatever they drank in that day. Because Paul writes this: do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourself. He talks about humility, he talks about value, he talks about ambition. Not looking to your own interest, not about being selfish, but you look to the interests of others. In your relationship with one another, have what? The same mindset as Jesus. That's what we need to have. The same mindset as Jesus. We need to love like Jesus. 1 Corinthians 13, 4-7. We need to forgive like Jesus and value the relationship like Jesus. And we need to forgive like Jesus and be faithfully committed like Jesus and accept like Jesus and build others up like Jesus and believe the best, just like Jesus did. This is foundational. We have got to make our relationships centered on Christ's relationship with us. Well, Peter writes that in 4:1. We go down to verse 4, 7-8, and he starts to give us principles. 2 verses packed with 3 powerful principles. Number 1, he says, the end of all things is at hand. Now, there's a lot of debate of what he meant there. Was he saying, oh, you know what, Jesus is coming back next week, next month, in a few years? And then people look at that and go, it didn't happen. Peter was he was misguided. He was deluded. I don't think that's what he's talking about. I think he says that everything that needed to be done, that Jesus needed to do, all the teaching that Jesus needed to teach and all the way Jesus needed to live, it's done. And I think he's using this phrase, and if I was to rewrite this, I would have written it, there's a lot of urgency at hand. Relationships should have urgency to them. And he says, all things are at hand. And then he gives us 2 principles that will counterbalance that diagram. Principle number 1 is this: choose to be clear-minded instead of cloudy thinking. And choose to be clear-minded instead of cloudy thinking. Look what he says. The end of all things is at hand, therefore be self-controlled and sober-minded. In other words, don't be drunk by clouded thinking, but be sober in your thinking. That's what he's talking about. Don't be intoxicated by negative thinking, but deal with the factors that might cloud your thinking. Deal with the factors that you're naturally cynical, or the home you grew up in, or a previous relationship, or triggers, or your current relationship. Deal with it. That's what he's saying, so that you can have clearer thinking. He's saying, what in your memory bank is messing you up right now when it comes to your thinking about the other person? So, we need to do that. Think about, I think what we do, many of us in our thinking, is we project. And here's what projection does. Let's look at the curfew deal. Some of you know that you skip curfew a lot. I won't ask you to raise your hand. Some of you know some of the things you were doing when you skipped curfew. And you think about that when your child, son or daughter, does. You think, I don't want them doing that, but I'll bet you they're just like me or just like their mother, whatever the case. And they're going to be doing it. That's what happens. The purchase is at the front door. Maybe you grew up in a home where money was just spent wildly and debt was crazy and it created all sorts of fights. Or maybe your dad was too busy and work was more important than family life, and that has left some marks or a scar. We need to choose to be clear-minded, not cloudy thinking. Now, there's some things that we need to do in order for that to happen. Here's the first one. Don't make stuff up. Don't create mental scenarios without facts. Don't make assumptions. Don't make up stories. Because these stories that we make up, and lots of people do relationally, they make up stories. And it's usually that the other person is trying to hurt me or wound me, or they don't respect me, or they don't care about me. And it's usually because we have some issue of self-worth and we think they're doing it to us. And we make stuff up, which leads to the second one: gather all the facts. Don't make stuff up. Listen for the truth. Let them speak before you react or respond. Ask questions. Give space for it to happen. Because the woman with the shopping bags, it's her birthday in 3 weeks. Her mother came to town. She lives out of town. She won't be around for the birthday. And she took her daughter out and bought her all these things. It didn't cost them anything. The guy who's home late from work for the third night in a row, one of his coworkers had a seizure and he took him to the hospital and stayed with him till they admitted him. The student who broke curfew, they didn't drink at all, but all their friends did. And they decided to be the designated driver so their friends didn't get any trouble, and they were driving them home, but their battery must have died somehow on their phone because they've been having problems with it. The Facebook party that was hosted at a friend's house, it wasn't her party, it was her brother's party. And yes, he has some of the same friends, but it was his party, not hers. How important is it for us not to make stuff up and for us to gather the facts? Thirdly, this is a big one. This will, to some of you, are going to feel uneasy about this one. 3, avoid involving others. Avoid that. You know, if you're that woman in your husband's home 3 nights in a row, don't pick up the phone and phone your best girlfriend who is divorced from her husband because he had an affair and he was out late all the time. Don't do that. Don't call your buddies and complain about how much their wives spend and your wife spends. Don't call your mother and get her involved. I'm telling you, you think I'm joking. That's not even funny. I'm just saying, here's what we do. We call people who will agree with us and fuel our thinking and emotions. We never call someone and say, well, you need to believe the best. You go, sorry, I got to call somebody else. All right? Avoid this at all possibilities, because this one is where the game is won or lost so many times. Next. Don't rehearse the confrontation. Oh, when they get home, I got it all figured out. I've got it all rehearsed. I know what I'm going to say. I'm going to win the Academy Award for the angry spouse or friend or child when they get home. And then lastly, kill the ants. Automatic negative thinking. Because we get into that cycle where we always give into always or never, focus on the negative, mind reading. You know, we know what's going on. Then you start thinking with your feelings, and, you know, negative labels get attached, and you blame yourself or you blame the others. Be aware of those things. This is what we've got to do. This is what we've got to do. Secondly, be self-controlled, not emotionally out of control, right? He says, okay, clear the clouding thinking. Now let's deal with the emotions. And he uses this little phrase, therefore be self-controlled. And this is a tough one. This can be so challenging, self-controlled, keeping these emotions in check. I read a book called The Happiness Hypothesis, and the author talks about your emotions as an elephant, a big elephant, and your logic is the rider on the elephant. And when the elephant decides to charge, the rider has no way of stopping it. And that's true, and that's why this is so difficult, because when emotions get engaged, past memories become negative ones, you experience what I call an amygdala hijack. Well, I didn't call it, somebody else calls it that, where you react and respond in emotional, primal, angry ways. And then logic kicks in, you go, why did I say that? I thought about that day in that garage. Now, how do you know that you're at that point where the elephant is in charge? For the sake of your prayers, the NIV says, so that you can pray. If you can't pray about it, you're crossing the line. You know you're crossing the line. But if you can pray about it and choose to say, God, let me love like you love. Let me forgive. Let me believe the best like you believe the best. Let me keep my emotions in check. Give me the fruit of the Spirit, because self-control is the fruit of the Spirit. That's why it's so hard. And that's why we in ourselves can't fully do it. We need the Holy Spirit to give us self-control. Imagine asking Jesus to give you the same attitude as he has towards you when you mess up, reminding you of his grace and forgiveness, reminding how he would respond. Imagine if you paused and prayed for the other person and hoped everything was okay. Never easy. But we've got to figure out, how do we keep this in check? And then lastly, my time is up, but we'll go here anyway. Lastly, it requires a growing relationship. It does. That's what he says. Above all, keep loving other earnestly, with intensity. Grow the relationship. The more you grow the relationship, the easier it is to believe the best, especially when little things happen that are out of character, because love covers over a multitude of little things, little sins. This is about putting a blanket over the little sins, not the big sins, not the repeated behavior, not the things that are destructive in the relationship. He's just saying, don't have the wrong idea. Don't create the wrong motive. Let your growing relationship cover over a multitude of small stuff. That's what I think we need to do, is to deepen our love relationship, because the more you love, the more you trust, and the less you fear. You see, here's what I want to tell you, and then I'm done. The more you assume the worst, and the more you project it, and you know what you're going to do? You're going to drive the other person into hiding, because they feel they have no opportunity to tell the truth, and they become afraid. And they feel attacked because of your negative opinion at every motive. And what do? They lie to protect, and it only makes it work. There's only two reasons people lie. They're pathological, or they're protecting themselves. If we continue to assume the worst and do all of this and let the emotions get out of control, you know what people are going to do in your world? They're going to lie. So if you've got people lying to you over and over and over again, yes, they have a problem. I'm not dismissing the lying. But you need to look in the mirror and go, am I doing something that is creating this? It's very, very important. So I just want to close with one question. What are you going to do? Believe the best or assume the worst? You get a choice in this. The quality of our relationships affects the quality of our lives. Nothing is more life-giving and life-enriching and life-enhancing than relationships. What are you going to do? What are you going to choose? And are you going to do what it takes to be better at believing the best, or do nothing and continue to assume the worst? Let's pray. And so, Father, today we just praise you and thank you that you love us in such an enormous way, that you forgive us, that you have grace for us, that you are good to us, and you always believe the best. You look at us through the eyes of Jesus, and you see us as unblemished, without spot, without brokenness, and you look at us and you say, you are my son, you are my daughter, I'm well pleased, I love you. And it's hard. We can't do that as humans, because we're not you, and lots of things that would get in the way. But Lord, teach us, help us, work in us so that we can be better at believing the best of others, no matter what, and less assuming the worst. But I also do pray, if there are key issues in relationships, whether they be marriages between moms and dads, or between parents and children, or friends or coworkers, if there's stuff that needs to be dealt with, give them the courage to deal with it, whatever it takes. Not so they toss away a relationship, but so they build one up, because those are where we find the greatest joy. I think we find joy in relationships, but there's even greater joy when the relationship gets fixed. Help us in these 4 weeks to look at some things that will help us live in better relationships, the kind of relationships you want for us. In your name we pray. Amen.